Hello and welcome back to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mari of Drea Renee Knits, and this is where I try to answer some of your questions about knitting and spinning and random other things. So let's dive in. Today I'm wearing my Junction sweater, which is one of my all-time favorites. This is knit up in Bishi Boosh. I think I used their lamb's wool cashmere blend, and it, if you can see, like, you can't, I'm too far away, but it is like so, like, maybe you can kind of see the drape when I do that. It is like light as a feather, so it really kind of feels like a ready to wear sweater. I paired it with Spin Cycle yarns dyed in the wool for the color work. But I love it because that little touch of cashmere and the spin of the yarn's more like a woolen spun. It's just so warm, even though it's really, really lightweight. So anyways, it's one of my faves. And of course, I will make sure to link it below. I actually prepared today by having a little notebook and a pen so I could remember the links that I said I would add. So Junction will be below in the show description. And there's a little housekeeping, a few questions I've gotten a few times that weren't really like episode questions, but were handy to know kind of questions. So one is Shifty, the sweater that is on Ravelry and on my website, is that the new Shifty, the updated and better than ever Shifty? It is. So same pattern, I just went through and completely reworked it, but I'm not selling like two different versions of Shifty, so you can just go to the original Shifty page on either site, and I think I have to sneeze. What was I saying? And when you purchase the pattern, the PDF you receive will be Shifty 2.0, the most up-to-date, revamped, really awesome one. And PayPal. So there are some people that cannot use PayPal for an array of different reasons. And PayPal, it seems, has recently changed something. So it's become more difficult to check out as a guest on PayPal. So for those of you who, for one reason or another, don't want to use PayPal, my website, there is a non-PayPal option. The only thing to keep in mind is at this time, I have no way to link my website to Ravelry. So for those of you who really love the library function in Ravelry to store all your patterns, there's no way to transfer your patterns there. If you want them in your Ravelry library, they do have to be purchased there. And then another one, so there's two more. A lot of people ask about my camera that I use for filming these. It is just my phone. I have an iPhone and it is on the video function, and that's about as fancy as I get. I have a weird little arm thing they sell. They're all over the place. I used to get ads for them all the time on Instagram, but it's just like a clamp that holds my phone, and I try to face it in my general direction. That's it. I don't use anything special. I don't have lighting. We do have some nice cameras that we use for like the photography of our knitwear, but I don't use those for this because I'm lazy. I only have, this is kind of like bonus, and I only have so much time to do these. So if I had to go through and like super edit videos and figure all that out, I mean, there's some, whatever you want to call them, vloggers, YouTube podcasters, video podcasters that do these amazing videos with all these edits, and they're really funny, and I just applaud those people, and I don't know how they find the time to like, oh my gosh, I saw a knitting one the other day that just like popped up into my feed as I was loading my video. Wish I could remember the name of it. If I could, I'd link it below. But this woman, I don't know who she was, but she was hilarious. She had great little video clips that she strung together, and I was like, man, if there's only more time in the day. But yeah, I just use my phone. And then another one I get all the time is my skincare routine. I don't really have one. I am very lucky in that I have a friend, my best friend's an esthetician, and then my sister works for Sephora. So I have their guidance, but really I just wash my face and moisturize it. I do use Beauty Counter. A lot of people ask what makeup I use. They have like a get ready in 5-minute kit, and that's about all the time I have. So it's like a tinted moisturizer and a lip gloss and an eyebrow and I think mascara. But yeah, if you just go to Beauty Counter and type in like 5-minute maybe, or just look for their sets, like they sell little sets, but I've been very happy with it. So there's all those random little questions. Hopefully you find that helpful. All right, let's jump in. Excuse my congestion. I do think that I am kind of stuck in another little bit of a flare that has just left me constantly feeling under the weather. It doesn't seem to be a real cold. It's not COVID, but it leaves me sounding a bit more nasally and very tired. So I am gonna do my best to bring the energy for the next few minutes. All right, I'm a newish knitter. I've just completed my weekender light, but there's a definite difference in tension once I stopped knitting in the round and am knitting back and forth on the yoke. It's improved after blocking, but I can still see a looser tension. What would you recommend to avoid this in the future? Changing your needle size. So I love this question because our tension can change throughout all different kinds of parts of our project, so not to like freak anybody out like, I have to constantly check my tension. It's more that there are certain areas that are more prone to it, and those are really good to keep an eye on. So color work, for sure. People tend to tighten up when they're knitting color work because you're trying, and some people do go the other way. Some people get really loose in their color work because they're really afraid of having tight floats, so they might get a little overly loose. So color work is a place that tends to affect your gauge. Knitting in the round versus knitting flat, such as this knitter, absolutely affects your tension. Because purl stitches use more yarn than knit stitches, when you're knitting in the round, you're naturally going to use a little bit less yarn and have a little bit tighter gauge because you're not purling generally. I mean, obviously there are times when you're using purls in the round. But let's just think of this as stockinette stitch. Whereas when you are knitting stockinette stitch flat, you knit a row and then purl a row, knit a row, purl a row. So that is going to change because to do that wrong side, to do those purls, you're using a little bit more yarn there. So and I'm going to come back to that because that means that some people also do what's called rowing out. I feel like there's like this bright light over there. Is that like kind of intense? Can we adjust that a little? Is that better? Ooh, I don't know. Anyways, it'll be fine. It can cause rowing out, and so we will talk a little bit about that as well, but I'll come to that at the end. I don't want to forget though. What else? Different circumferences. So small circumference compared to large circumference. So if you are knitting a sweater, I have found most knitters knit small circumference knitting, sleeves, socks, etc., tighter than large circumference knitting like a body. So a lot of people end up being like, my sleeves are too small or my sleeves are too tight compared to the body. Check your gauge. Like if this has happened to you in the past, I recommend actually going back and like checking to see if you tightened up. And I actually have started in most of my patterns, unless there's enough wiggle room. No, I pretty much always do it now. But I actually include a sleeve needle size because it is that frequent that most people do tighten up. And I mentioned this here before, but they do tighten up on their sleeves compared to their body. They're going to have a tighter gauge than they did here, and it can be significant. So the best way to avoid it is to check. As you're knitting, check your gauge every once in a while if you feel like your tension has changed. Usually we can see it visually, but with a sleeve especially, it might not be as noticeable because it is a smaller area, and unless you're kind of trying it on and being like, oh, that seems a little snug. So, and just check and use your tools. If your gauge is tightening up, then you need to go up a needle size to compensate for that. If it's loosening, then you need to go down a needle size. A lot of people need to go up a needle size if they're doing, let's say, a color work yoke, and then they can go down a needle size to finish the stockinette stitch body of that sweater. Now, rowing out. So, and again, so it would be the same thing to go back to this original question for the weekender. You knit the yoke, the top part of the sweater, you knit that flat, even though we've knit the body of it in the round. And so if your gauge loosened, you would just go down a needle size to compensate for that, to keep your tension even. That is our main goal, is that we keep our tension as even as possible throughout a project. So many things will affect it, such as your stress level that day, if you're watching an intense show, you know, if you feel really relaxed. But blocking and actually just wearing your garments, a lot of times they even out some of that, where it's not really noticeable at all, or if it is, it's only noticeable to you. So a lot of times it's not something you have to be super concerned about, but if it is a big difference, use your needles and change sizes to try and stay on gauge as close as possible. Now, rowing out. There are some people, when they are knitting stockinette stitch flat, because we do use more yarn for purl stitches, they will actually get what look like ridges in their stockinette stitch. Instead of being this really smooth, fluid fabric, it kind of is undulating a little bit. And the easiest way to fix that is to actually use 2 different needle tips on one cord if you're using circular needles. So for your knit stitches, your right side rows, you would want to use, let's say, the size needle you achieved gauge with. And then for the wrong side purl rows, you would use a needle that is one size smaller to help compensate, and that a lot of times can really help with that rowing out. If you have interchangeable needles, it's really nice because you can just put, you know, let's say a 7 size US 7 needle on one end and then a US 8 tip on the other. I'm sorry, you would want to go down to a 6. When I do things like that, I'm like, oh, I should restart. That's going to confuse somebody. But you want to go down a needle size for the purl rows. That's the important takeaway. If you don't have interchangeable needles, you could just use 2 different needles, you know, go back and forth. But that can help a lot. That being said, when I switched my knitting style from English to continental, I stopped rowing out. But I was weird, where most people, it's that their purls are too loose, is why they're rowing out. But I think I overcompensated for that, and I would like strangle the life out of my little purls, and I was too tight on my purl rows, and that's why I was rowing out. So continental actually helped me like loosen up a little, and now I don't row out at all. So I also think it's kind of neat to maybe try learning a different knitting style and seeing if that helps any tension or gauge issues. All right, next question. I am 74 and have developed a dowager's bump on my upper back dead center. It causes my sweaters to pull up and back and be too short. When knitting, can you tell me what I could do to combat this problem? Thank you so much for any advice you might have for me and others with this problem. Yes, I would add short rows. So where this would be tricky is in certain all over patterned sweaters. You're going to have to either be kind of comfortable with staying in pattern in short rows, which is very doable, but certain stitch patterns, it can be tricky. But if it's just, let's say it's a yoke sweater that only has patterning on the yoke and then it's a stockinette body, you can add short rows. Like most sweaters do have short rows at the upper back below the collar. So you could add another set of them below the yoke, right in this region. You could do a whole nother set of short rows. Sorry, I kind of made the camera shake. Or you could even put them right below the hem of the sweater to do a little drop hem in the back. And so you would want to play around with how much length you would like to add, but by working the back and forth in rows, you're going to add that extra length in the back so that it's not riding up for you anymore. I think that would be the best fix for that. All right. I'm new to knit-alongs and so excited and love the pictures of all the gorgeous knits and colors on Instagram. How do you post pictures of your work under the hashtag so that it shows up in the feed? When I post pictures, it just shows up with my Instagram name at the top and doesn't pop up under the feeds. I thought just adding the hashtag to the comments would do it, but it didn't. So it should. I have a feeling you might have a private account. If you have a private account, it won't show up in the hashtag for others to see because it's private. So when you choose the private function on Instagram, only people who follow you could see it. So if that's the issue, then you would need to make your account public if you want your photos to show up. If you don't want to make your account public, you can absolutely still see everybody else's. It's just they won't be able to see yours. But just adding that hashtag in your caption or in your comments will add it to the feed. Just make sure you spell it right. But otherwise, that should be all you need to do. Okie dokie. I am an experienced crochet maker and can happily crochet almost anything. I'd love to give knitting a go because I find there are more patterns to choose from that match my aesthetic. But I feel so discouraged starting a fiber skill from scratch. So their questions are, what's a high quality set of tools that you'd consider beginner friendly but not poorly made low quality? Should I use DPNs or circulars the way to go for socks? And for a crochet convert, continental or English? Let's do this in reverse. Continental is what I would say because I'm guessing you hold the yarn already in your left hand. At least most crocheters I've met hold their yarn in their left hand, and I have heard from them that they find continental to be more intuitive since that is what they're already naturally used to. And then 1 and 2 I'm going to go ahead and put together. It is personal preference, but I am a circular needle user. I have shown my needles on here many times, and they're over there, so I'm not gonna get up. I have another set right here. So I am a circular needle user. It is all I use. I don't use straight needles. I do not use double pointeds, and this is why. With my circular needles, I have an interchangeable set, meaning I can change the needle tips to adjust for how big they are, so for my needle size, and then I have different length cords. And the reason I prefer this is because that means I can have one set, and because I know everyone will ask, this is the Maxwell, which is from Magpie Fibers. I will link that yet again. I always get lots of questions. They call it a utility roll, and I do absolutely love this needle case because it holds all my things. So I love that I can have my needle tips and an arrangement of cords, and I can do anything I need to do on any of my projects. I don't have to go buy anything else. It's less space than fixed needles. And that is why I also do magic loop as opposed to double pointeds. Now, I know there are people who do not like magic loop. They are 100% double pointed needle people, and that is great. You want to use what feels best for you. For me, I want to know that if all of a sudden I'm ready to start a sleeve and I am on a traveling and I can just be like, oh, perfect. I could go ahead and grab a longer cord and do a magic loop and just start my sleeve. So there you go. There's my spiel on that. As far as a set of tools you'd consider beginner friendly. I've said this before and I will say it again. What I wish somebody had told me when I really got into knitting and it was becoming something that like I knew I was going to do in my life, I wish somebody had told me to stop buying fixed needles and buy a interchangeable set. Fixed needles can really add up, especially because sometimes you need the same size needle, but you need 2 sets of them for one project. And so interchangeable needle sets, I think, are just end up at the end of the day, they are a bigger financial investment in the beginning, but it pays off in the long term. I mean, some fixed needles are easily $20 per needle. where you can get, so two brands I highly recommend are Chow are my favorite, and those are pretty much always the needles I use. They have a sharp point, they have a really smooth join, and they have a great cord on them. And they, I think, are priced very well for what you get. I think it's maybe $100 for a full set, like size 2 through 15, maybe, which is that is like almost every size needle you would need until you start doing socks that might need a 0 or a 1, or if you like really chunky knitting. And then another brand that's very comparable to that would be Haya. If you prefer wood needles, I really like the Luka needles, Lykke. Those ones I think are pricier than like the Chow or the Haya. Now, to make sure you like them, you might still want to just invest in one fixed pair to make sure that knitting is something you're really going to want to do more and more, and you want to invest in materials for it. So maybe start with one for a project, and then if you're like, oh yeah, this has got a place in my heart, then I absolutely recommend an interchangeable needle set. I think it'll save you money down the road, and you'll have everything you need. And you can also buy like an extra set of tips. You can buy extra cords. If you're like, man, I use 32-inch cords all the time, I wish I had a couple of them because I'm not a monogamous knitter, things like that. Then you can also buy those individually, which is nice. Okay. By the way, this is a full year. I'm pretty sure this is the 52nd episode. Isn't that exciting? Okay. I am just learning how to brioche knit, and as a first project, I decided to make the Harlow worsted hat. I watched the video for the 2-color tubular cast on tutorial, which was great, as long as I was only casting on about 20 stitches. However, as soon as I cast on the amount of stitches needed for the hat, it started to twist around my cable, which made it difficult to knit the first tubular setup row. What is your suggestion to prevent this from happening when using this type of cast on? So 2-color tubular cast on is, I don't have an example right next to me. So it's beautiful. I love tubular cast-ons. If you've knit many of my patterns, I use it quite frequently. It is a little finicky, and where people can get have trouble, especially in the beginning when you're first learning it, is when you're using something like a circular needle and you've got this thin cord. Especially when you're doing like worsted weight, and so you have a thicker needle tip and then a thinner cord, is they can kind of spiral around. And because it's this looser, flexible cast on, sometimes you're like, wait, now where do I knit into this? So I actually recommend using a straight needle for your cast on. And then after doing that initial 1 to 2 setup rows, you could then just transfer your stitches to a circular needle to join it in the round, because you knit the first 2 setup rows flat. And I think eventually you won't need to do that. At least that's been my experience. I am totally 5 cast on, like 200 stitches for tubular cast on, and it's been fine. But I think through the practicing stage and doing it the first few times, it might save you a lot of frustration. So just using a straight needle, because that doesn't get thin all of a sudden, and it doesn't have that tendency to spiral around it as bad. All right, let's go ahead and end this with a little spinning question. I have recently started spinning, and because there are no local yarn stores near me, I have mostly been learning by watching classes on Craftsy, including the worsted to woolen class you have mentioned in past episodes. I am curious to know what kind of drafting techniques you use when you spin for socks. I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed by all the options there seem to be, but I would like to try to spin for socks because socks are one of the things that I knit the most. You know, I actually do kind of default to socks when I just want to spin and like don't want to have to think too heavily, like plan too much in advance. I tend to spin for socks. I'm like, I always know I can use another pair of socks, or somebody in my family can use another pair of socks. And sock yarn is fabulous for shawls, cowls, sweaters. Like you could absolutely use it in other ways too. So I feel like it is a nice default. So I generally use a short forward for socks. Sometimes I might use a short backward, but I pretty much always do a worsted draft for socks for the strength. Woolen is nice because it's so warm. It traps, so woolen spun yarn traps more air. And so as your body warms that air, it's very insulating, where worsted spun yarn doesn't have that much air trapped. You kind of smooth it out as you're spinning. But I feel that my socks, even worsted spun, are definitely warmer than commercial socks I might buy, and I want them to last as long as possible after I've put in all that hard work of both spinning the yarn and knitting the socks. So I like to do short forward or short backward, but definitely a worsted draw for me personally. And I'll also say, like, just to continue on that for 1 second, right now I am spinning up what will be a 3-ply sock yarn, and I am using one bat from Artifacts of Appreciation, and this she blended to be good for socks. So there's like a lot of long wools in here, but because it's a bat, it's naturally gonna trap more air. Even though I'm drafting it worsted, it's more of a woolen preparation, so that will trap some air in there to help with the warmth. And so I'm gonna have 1 ply be from the bat, and then I'm actually doing 2 different painted braids for the other plies, just as a really fun color experiment. So I will show more of that as it progresses. I'll show you guys the bat a little bit. There's like, I don't know why it's so glary today. It's actually really overcast, but I feel like, and I cleaned the lens, but there, that's better. You could kind of see it from afar a little better, but it has like these purples and like this turquoise right here. There's some sari silk in here. I think this also had some of that baby doll, is it Southdown? I'm probably mixing up breeds at this point. Okay. I am kind of driving myself crazy listening to my nasally voice, so I am going to wrap this up, but I did want to, excuse me, show you a little sneak peek. So I, as a little treat myself moment before the holidays, I ordered some yarn from the Wandering Flock. If you are not familiar with their yarn, I'm just now remembering a couple things that I should have written to link to. So I'll link to them and to Artifacts of Appreciation. She just did these striped sock bats that look really amazing too. I know they're sold, but she's a fun one to keep an eye on. But I had found the Wandering Flock before the holidays, and they were showing pictures of like sock sets, and their colors just like speak to my happy place of, you cannot look at them and not just feel like joyful, in my opinion. So I ordered 1 skein each of my 5 favorite colors, and then I was like, well, I have to use these together. So I then was like, I just want a feel-good project. So in my early days of designing, I would do what I called like a creativity experiment. And so that is how Find Your Fade came to be. The first one was actually called the Fun Shawl because I was just like, what would be fun to do next in this shawl? So this is another one of those where I was like, I'm just gonna knit what feels good to me right now and what like I'm craving. So I'm almost done with it. But it is like sheer happiness for me. I love it so much. So I'm almost done and I'm really excited about it, but it's just like a pile of delight. So I'll show more of that when it's actually not on my nails. I'm actually halfway through a row right now, and so it's like at kind of the worst point to attempt to show it because it's all bundled up on itself. But you can at least look at these amazing colors. I may have ordered more for a sweater in a couple of the colors. All right, well, I think that's it. Thank you so much. I know there are some of you who have been with me, I think, for this whole year, and I thank you so much for joining me, all of you for putting in your questions. This was such an unexpected addition to what I do, and I really look forward to it every week. There was definitely, when I decided to make it a regular thing, I was like, oh, will I be able to keep up with this? Will I have time for it? But I find myself looking forward to it every week. I really love opening and reading your questions. They are so thoughtful, and they also help me as I write patterns, because I'm keeping those in mind and what questions might come up and what information can be helpful and what you're interested in. And so I'm just really grateful to all of you for being here with me and continuing to inspire me. And I hope these inspire you and give you courage to try some new things. And know I'm here rooting for you, cheering for you. And I will see you episode 53 in about a week. But I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you get to do something creative, and I'll see you next time. Bye.